I will start by introducing the Cosseyware Brickyard and discussing its founders and development before outlining the basic process of making the wares. I'll then set out the context for architectural ceramics in 19th century Norwich before speaking about three distinct uses of Cosseyware in the city. Firstly, relating to leisure through the plantation gardens, and then to work through George Skipper's architectural offices, and finally the use of Cosseyware in domestic buildings, looking at houses across the city in the 19th century. I will finish by summarising what lasting contribution Cosseyware left on the streets of Norwich, specifically the fine line between bespoke designs, architectural sculpture and mass production. Many of the examples I will discuss will include the works of Norwich architects George Skipper and Edward Boardman, who rightly occupy a key place in scholarship on Victorian Norwich. However, the importance of Cosseyware has had less of a place, and this talk also hopes to credit the materials behind the men. Firstly, though, where is the brickyard and why is it there? The yard was founded by George Gunton in 1836 and closed in 1915. This was due to changes in architectural fashions and the First World War. The yard was located in Cossey, a small village about 4 miles northwest of Norwich. The village is located within a valley of the River Wensum on Lord Stafford's estate. The Cosseyware yard was situated on the west bank of the river, which was an area extremely rich in red and white clay. What is Cosseyware? Well, Cosseyware, by my own definition, includes bricks, tiles, decorative pieces, and sculpture of red, white, and buff clay and earthenware. Cosseyware is unglazed, which gives it a signature matte finish, and characteristically has very detailed and sinuous look, which makes it very distinctive. Cosseyware can be seen everywhere in Norwich, from houses, non-conformist chapels, gardens, hotels, banks, schools, shops, and offices, to name a few building types. Back to the yard. Whilst there is evidence of small-scale brickmaking in the village before 1826, the Guntons opened the Cossey Brickyard on the land of Lord Stafford, Sir George William Jerningham. In the same year, Jerningham had his title of Lord Stafford of Cossey restored, and he proposed to expand and remodel his Tudor ancestral seat, Cossey Hall, seen completed here on the left. His appointed architect was John Chessel Buckler, shown here, best known for his work restoring medieval churches and cathedrals, and coming second behind Charles Barry for the rebuilding of the Palace of Westminster. Cossey Hall was his first major new build project, and he designed a richly detailed Tudor Gothic building 7 times larger than the Tudor Hall which had been on the site. Sadly, this was demolished in 1920. The superfluous nod to medieval architecture was perhaps to reinstate Lord Stafford's ancestral claim to 2/3 of the parish, after he successfully obtained a reversal of an attainder against his name in 1824. Before then, he had lost his property and hereditary titles, as well as the ability to pass on titles to his heirs. The mock medieval statement house spoke of nobility and lineage. However, Stafford would need to source pattern chimneys, pinnacles, and crenellated parapets en masse, and also who to deliver this. And so, to save time and money, Stafford opened the yard under the operation of his estate tenant George Gunton and his son Frederick. George and Frederick came from a long line of brickmakers. They set to work building kilns, drying sheds, and workshops needed for such a project. The earliest depiction of the Cosseyware yard appears on the Cossey tithe map of 1840, shown here, where an enormous clay pit fed the site from the north. This is an altered version of the tithe map, but helps us to understand the processes through its really amazing level of detail. So travelling forward for a moment, the 1896 map shows the expansion of the yard, and the construction of a tramway to assist the movement of clay from the pit to the yard. And then on the left here, there's a LiDAR scan of the site, and you can just about make out the shape of some of the structures which have long since been demolished. I think there might be some potential for industrial archaeology here, but I haven't been to the site myself. Whilst the yard had specialist carvers to create bespoke pieces, most Cosseyware was made using timber moulds, pictured here on the left. Whilst the 1840 and 1896 OS maps prove that there is some growth in the yard, it is largely the process for making the wares largely remained consistent throughout the 19th century, and the different stages were carried out on a seasonal basis. So, once the clay was dug out by hand, usually before the 1st of November, it was brought to site. The large quantities of chalk in the clay would need to be drawn out through a horse-drawn pug mill. Here, the horse walked around, turning a horizontal wheel at the centre from where a paddle was used to stir the clay. This stirring or turning was usually done by the 1st of February. The clay would then be pressed into timber moulds on makers' tables or shaped, usually by the 1st of March. And I recently read that timber moulds for brick making in England can date back as early as the 13th century, so a really antiquated method of moulding bricks. The timber moulds as well would be produced from detailed drawings, either by an architect or one of the team. The sheds on the site were lined with shelves for the wares to dry. Hot water pipes ran alongside the drying shelves to aid the hardening of unburnt wares before they entered the kiln. Artisan carvers on the yard would hand carve bespoke pieces and make good any blemishes on moulded pieces. And once dried, the wares were fired on grates in Dutch kilns for 48 hours. So once Cossey Hall was finished in 1836, the Guntons took the opportunity to expand the business into Norwich by advertising in both the local and national press. After all, at this time they had at least 1,000 moulds left over from the house ready for reuse, as well as a plentiful supply of clay, and by 1844 the railways had come to Norwich, which would assist the movement of wares and their pool of clients. And indeed many brickyards of this time were deliberately built near railways for transportation. My favourite quote from press articles is from the Norfolk Chronicle, which describes Cosseyware as the most beautiful specimens or mouldings ever produced. So now to move on to Victoria Norwich. So indeed, the Gunton brothers were tapping into a wider national trend by expanding the Cosseyware business. By the 1860s, architectural ceramics, in particular terracotta, were becoming more popular thanks to improved firing technology, the offer of a less expensive alternative to carved stone. They were more resilient to polluted atmospheres of industrial towns and cities, and it was much easier to achieve intricate decorative wares in little time through the mould method of mass production. But on the other hand, Cosseyware was unique and offered something specifically to Norwich. So the introduction of white wares to the city. As many of you will know, Norwich is predominantly a city of red brick and flint. White wares added a new colour to the city's historic palette in the early to mid 19th century. This was especially suitable for buildings with classical aspiration, as white wares often mimicked stone and stone dressings. So here we have, bottom left, the purpose-built solicitor's office on Castle Chambers, and then above we've got Edward Boardman's Sunday School to the Methodist Church. The wares also became part of a distinct architectural language. So as mentioned, Cosseyware was widely used by Norwich's foremost architects, Boardman and Skipper. Whilst they were building new buildings, they were also refronting older buildings. So left here, we've got number 6 Tombland, which is actually an 18th century townhouse, but it's been given a Cosseyware jacket. And then on the right, we've got the Royal Hotel, which was a new build, again, clad in Cosseyware. Cosseyware was also used in Boardman's conversion of Norwich Castle to a museum from 1887, where there are many decorative bricks, largely neo-Tudor in style. And here you can also see what remains of Boardman's own offices on Queen Street. And what I really like about this building is the very distinct typeface, which you can also see on the Maid's Head Hotel in Tombland and the Hotel de Paris in Cromer. And finally, the historicist. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far forward. Let me go back. There we go. And finally, the historicist styling of the wares, often Tudor, Gothic, and medieval domestic, complemented Norfolk, particularly as a county with some of the best medieval buildings in England. Prosperity-wise, Norfolk was second to London before 1780, and this was largely due to its trade of the Low Countries and economic success from the cloth industries, but also specifically relating to bricks through trade with the Hanseatic League through the ports at Norwich and Lynn. And here you can see a chimney from the Oxburgh Hall Gatehouse, and you'll see later on in the talk that it's almost replicated in one of the Cosseyware catalogues. So now moving on to the first of my 3 examples, I'm going to talk about the plantation gardens. So the plantation gardens were laid between 1857 and 1861, just as the Guntons were growing their business. The site was a former flint quarry in Higham, a parish west of Norwich. In the 19th century, Higham was emerging as a villa suburb for Norwich's growing middle classes. It offered generous houses with gardens. This particular site was leased for 75 years to Henry Trevor, who was a successful Norwich businessman in cabinet making and upholstering. Trevor commissioned 2 neoclassical villas, either side of the quarry, which both survive as the Beeches and the Plantation. However, for the 2.5-acre sunken former quarry pit, Trevor, with guidance from Edward Boardman, wished to create a pleasure garden for public use. So his design exploited the topography of this steeply banked pit, with extensive terraces and stairs in the style of an Italian Renaissance garden. But this was alongside kind of ruinous Gothic structures. And here we've got the now sadly lost Palm House, which was made by the Norwich iron manufacturers Bolton and Paul. So the entire garden, so the walls, balustrades and structures were clad in flint and pieces of Cosseyware from the yard. So there's bits of chimneys, architraves, date stones, decorative bands, Gothic tracery. So the garden was essentially a Cosseyware grotto, a sort of 3-dimensional catalogue of white, red wares, brick, flint and stone. For the first time, the wares were arranged randomly rather than to a strict course, and even more unusually, the architectural ceramics lose their function of cloaking or disguising a building, or hiding the walling of a newer building. Here, the viewers can see all faces of the wares, not just the front, but also architrave pieces separated from doors, roof copings from ridges, and date stones from walls. Here, the viewer gets a sense of their 3-dimensionality and construction. And indeed, you might say these individual pieces could be appreciated as art objects or sculptures in their own right. So on the one hand, the plantation garden continues a tradition of the very strict classical villa with a fantasy garden. The plantation gardens might be compared to Pope's Grotto at Twickenham by a classical villa, or the grotto at Stourhead from the 18th century. And indeed, many of the different styles of the pieces of Cosseyware have a flavour of the Grand Tour and 18th century garden buildings. But on the other hand, this is very much a celebration of the new, having fun with industry and mass production at a time when art and sculpture were very much being criticised by critics such as John Ruskin, who was condemning the loss of craftsmanship due to mass production. So if Bolton and Paul were able to test the limits of iron and decoration, why couldn't the Guntons do the same with their wares? So to conclude this section on the plantation gardens, the gardens offered new possibilities for the wares, a sort of living catalogue which celebrates architectural sculpture as easily accessed and quickly and efficiently made, a celebration of local innovation and Norwich's industries, a plethora of styles and forms from Italianate to Tudor Gothic and neoclassicism, and a new public space where the wares could be widely seen and admired. So moving on to my next example, which is George Skipper's architectural offices at 7 London Street. So this case study steps away from the folly and fantasy of the plantation gardens to the latter period of Cosseyware, looking at the newly built architectural offices of George Skipper, who by this period had outgrown his offices on OP Street and moved to a larger premises at number 7 London Street. And this is between the Gerald's department store on the corner here and can't see it in this photo, but there's a 17th century building on the other side. So London Street had been a very fashionable shopping street in Norwich since the 18th century, but it had largely had a medieval footprint with side lanes and very windy streets. The City Council initiated a widening scheme to better connect the marketplace with the railway station, and due to the heavier footfall between the two, many new Victorian commercial buildings sprung up on the street, and many of these had actually been designed by Edward Boardman. It's interesting that Skipper chose to move his offices to such a commercial hotspot as London Street. In the 1890s, architects were not allowed to advertise their profession externally, so a new office facade would somehow have to inform passers-by of the architectural service, but in adherence to this rule, as well as complementing the very fashionable character of the street. So the offices were built in 2 phases, the left bay in 1896, and the right bay wasn't actually fully constructed until 1903 or 4. The relief panels were carved by James Minns, who was one of the yard's artisan carvers who worked on bespoke pieces. So the result was a very intense Cosseyware frontage, as you can see. Only the upper 2 stories survive. So the facade consists of a pair of oriel windows framed by arch casements and eyebrow hoods, which was very signature of Skipper. And then the upper part of the building has the terracotta parapet mounted with 3 broad finials rising and these kind of octagonal buttresses here. So what's interesting about this building? Well, the facade itself appears sculptural. The mouldings that we saw as fragments in the plantation gardens are here laid seamlessly. You can barely see the mortar lines. It's as if the building was carved as a whole piece rather than a sum of parts. So here Cosseyware able to deceive us. Stylistically, I think you'll agree the facade really shows off. Perhaps it's an advertisement for the versatility of Cosseyware. So in one facade alone, we see Skipper's hand, terracotta, red brick, flat pieces, three-dimensional pieces, bespoke relief carvings. The facade accommodates 31 windows, and stylistically you can see Baroque, Romanesque and Gothic features. It's also functional, so as an architect's office, light is really important. The parapet has been designed to disguise the north lights, which are on the roof. But most importantly, I think I want to draw attention to these 6 bas relief terracotta narrative panels, which illustrate the architect's profession. I'm very sorry that the photos aren't clear. It's a very tricky site to photograph, but in the left-hand panel, Skipper is depicted with his family stood behind him. He is inspecting a piece of Cosseyware handed to him by one of the yard's artisan carvers, possibly James Minns. And in the background, there are faint lines of a classical building. And then in the right-hand panel, shown here, Skipper discusses plans with the client. He is depicted with various building craftsmen who play a part in the composition of the building. So we've got a stonemason, bricklayer, a carpenter, a metalsmith, and a plasterer. So what does this tell us about Cosseyware? Well, I think it shows us that very high quality facades can be achieved. Cosseyware offers bespoke pieces as well as everyday design that can be used on a variety of buildings of different architectural styles in the city, and also used by one of the biggest names in 19th century Norwich architecture. But most importantly, I think it shows us that Cosseyware occupies a place along traditional craft skills such as metalsmithing, stonemasonry, and we may even read Cosseyware as triumphant over all the crafts, as Skipper has used it as a primary material to decorate his office. So finally, moving on to my third case study, and finishing with domestic buildings in Norwich. So we've seen Cosseyware in its 2 extreme forms, as a formal city centre frontage and the components of a pleasure garden. Now we will look at Cosseyware as an embellishment to people's homes and everyday buildings in Norwich. I'll argue that the prolific output of the firm in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created a new language for the city. Here you can see a number of examples of wares on more modest buildings, and I would encourage you to have a walk around, particularly the Earlham Road, Unthank Road suburbs of Norwich, or the Golden Triangle, where much of it survives. So the first catalogue for Cosseyware was published in 1903. However, from rooting around in the archives, I found a number of much earlier pamphlets, such as chimney stack sections. So I believe the catalogue compiled many earlier pieces all in one place. I think this is interesting because Cosseyware was just one of many architectural ceramic firms who produced a catalogue of wares, and it taps into a much wider Victorian obsession with catalogues, the idea that the customer could be their own architect and have the pages of designs at their fingertips. Crucially, the catalogue allowed for the mass production of wares and was a very quick and affordable way of spreading the word. The catalogue is very extensive and it's split into all different features of the building. So windows, doors, tiles, chimneys, string courses, and architraves, just to name a few. And it covers a very wide range of architectural styles. So I had a lot of fun walking around Norwich playing Spot the Cosseyware. So here we have a Gothic window tracery from the Park Lane Chapel, which would definitely fool you that it was painted stone, but it's actually lifted straight out of the Cosseyware catalogue. And I think this sort of shows you the scale and confidence of some of the wares that the yard produced. Here we have 22 Thorpe Lane, which is very near to Norwich railway station. This example I found interesting because here either the architect had adapted this door I found in the catalogue, or maybe this was a bespoke commission based on this door. So perhaps people could choose different wares and kind of make requests to the yard and have kind of bespoke pieces or join pieces together, which is also interesting. And here are a few more details. Again, some little snippets from the catalogue, just to give you a sense of the variety. So the brick and tile works were sold with the residential estate, which included a number of smaller houses, in 1918 at the Royal Hotel in Norwich. The hall was then demolished in 1920 after being used by the War Office in the First World War. And that marks the end of Cosseyware. I hope you've enjoyed this talk and agree with me that Cosseyware made a significant contribution to late 19th, early 20th century character of Norwich and provided very distinct architectural language to the city for a variety of uses. And all thanks to the ambition and business savvy of the Gunton brothers. So whilst I've spoken about Norwich today, I think the next study, which would be interesting, is to look at a county-wide study of Cosseyware. So who knows, I might do that another time. I'll hand back to Jess and Ian now.
Okay. Am I here?
You are, yes.
I am. Right. Oh, well, thank you, Jess, for that wonderful talk, a second time round, and fully heard and appreciated this time. It really was excellent. One point before we move on to questions from our listeners, that picture you had of Norwich Station was, of course, the rebuild. That was 1886, that station. The original Norwich Station was 1844, and I think it was much plainer. But the present Norwich Thorpe Station is magnificent, isn't it? Wonderful.
Yes.
Looks like a chateau or something. That's lovely. Anyway, over to our audience. Have you questions for Jess?
We've got one in the chat that says, it's from Simon Wood, and he says, thank you. Could you mention how the products were fixed to buildings, please?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think it depends. I think I think the bricks were probably kind of built as kind of normal brick walls were with mortar, but I think the terracotta could have been fixed with maybe kind of metal fixings going into the mortar of the masonry wall behind, but I would have to probably do a bit more research to answer that question properly, but good question.
Oh, Ian's got one. Jess, I don't know if you could stop sharing your screen, then I'd be able to see if anybody's sort of got their hands up or anything. Thank you. Ian, you had a question. Oh, sorry.
You're muted.
I think that was me because you unmuted yourself and then I asked you to unmute. So it cancelled it out.
Obviously, the whole of this exercise arose because of the good clay at Cossey. Much of the centre of Britain is made of similar clay. Are there similar yards elsewhere in the country, or is Cossey obviously not unique, but is it the forerunner?
I think there were a number of similar yards at this time around the country. Recently I've been doing a little bit of research into brickworks in Kent, so around sort of Sittingbourne, Rainham area. And in fact, some of those brickyards are much earlier than the Cosseyware yard in Norwich, but are using a lot of similar processes. So the kind of processes I outlined. And I've looked at like OS maps, and the sort of layout of the yard was very similar. I think some yards, as the 19th century went on, were trying to kind of have their own sort of unique selling point, whether that was that they were doing decorative bricks or kind of engineering bricks. So they were having kind of specialisms. But I don't think Cosseyware was unique nationally. I think mainly for Norwich.
Interesting. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Adrian Parker asks, let's just move, somebody else put a question in the chat. Where is the title page building with the wonderful reticulated decorative window head?
Ah, yes, that's the Royal Hotel in Norwich, at the top of the Prince of Wales Road.
And then Sally asks, do we know the names of the designers of the different mouldings? The Gunton brothers themselves or others?
Sadly, there isn't much documentary evidence that survives, at least in the archives, which provides different names other than James Minns, who I think was the kind of head of the kind of bespoke carvers. I'd be interested to know if there's any other places where documentary evidence survives, but I think because there probably were so many different people in the yard and they probably had a number of different jobs, I'm not sure that they would necessarily.
Ian?
Is there a difference between the obviously bespoke wares like on the front of Boardman's building and the things which can obviously be moulded and repeated, like the door mouldings, the door frames and everything else? Did they have some specialist workers just to do carving, or were they moulded as well? Did they make moulds first and then cast them, or were they carved them from the solid?
From the photos of the moulds that I've seen, a lot of the decoration is actually kind of built into the mould. So I think the artisan carvers were largely working off like sheets of clay to a client's drawing, probably by an architect. But I am aware that bricks that came out, so when clay was kind of hardening and it had come out of the mould, sometimes carvers would work, particularly if there'd been like blemishes or damage, in order to kind of make good wares. But I'm not too sure whether they were carving into moulded wares, but there's nothing to suggest they wouldn't be able to.
Well, it's hardening, I suppose you can carve into it, can't you?
Yeah, that's often one of the best times to, actually. I know from personal experience.
And we've got another question in the chat. There was a family link with Oxborough through the Jerningham marriage. Do you know definitely if the Oxborough chimney you featured was original or if it was from the Gunton catalogue as featured in one of your slides?
I think that particular chimney is original, though having been to Oxborough and actually having walked around the roof and on the gatehouse, there are definitely parts which look like they could have been sort of 19th century restorations. And I wouldn't be surprised if Cosseyware was used, just because of how much you see it across Norwich, particularly on country houses and for much earlier buildings, because of how well it blends in. But I think that chimney might be earlier, just judging from its kind of patina.
There's some wonderful Cosseyware chimneys in Ringland. I don't know whether you've seen them, Jess. Village outside Norwich.
I possibly, is it? Is it the kind of lodge house that's at the side of the road?
Yes, yes,
Yeah, I have
yes.
seen that. Yeah, yeah, I saw they had scaffolding up not so long ago.
Yeah.
Quite similar to the painting of the lodge I showed. So there were two lodges originally at different entrances to Cossey Hall, and the house at Ringland looks suspiciously like one of the lodge designs. So I wonder if the architect shared it.
Yeah, quite likely. It's quite strange, isn't it, the way Cossey Hall was just demolished, 1920.
Yeah, 1920.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure how well it had been looked after by the war
The whole
office.
estate was sold off, I think, and new Cossey was built in the ground. Yes.
And actually, when I tried to access the site, so I showed that LiDAR scan earlier in the talk, it's really hard to get to because there's so many new houses on the new Cossey estate. So
right, we've had a flurry of further questions in the chat. One person said, I missed the beginning, but did lack of stone in the area add to its wider decorative use, the Cosseyware?
oh, definitely, yeah. And actually, that's part of the reason why the white wares were quite popular, using sort of whitish, greyish clay because they were able to mimic stone.
And then Sally comments that Mattershall Primary School had wonderful Cosseyware chimneys, but she thinks that it was demolished a few years ago. So that's a shame. And then from Bridget, she says, I wonder if you have looked at the collections in the Museum of Norwich, so the Bridewell Museum, and at Preston Hall. My memory is that there's a collection of Cossey bricks, catalogues, and also of brick moulds, several from the later brickyard at Little Plumstead. And she says she really enjoyed your talk. Many thanks.
Oh, thank you. I haven't been to Gresson Hall, actually. I have been to the Museum of Norwich. I wonder if they have their own kind of on-site archive. It would be interesting to know and probably answer a few more of those questions about who else was involved in the yard and whether there were other carvers. Because as I was saying, the documentary evidence, at least from the Norfolk Record Office, the Heritage Centre, and published material is quite thin on the ground.
And Penny asks, why was the time of various stages of the manufacture important? Because I remember you were saying about the 1st of February being a specific date for when they would turn the clay, and then the 1st of March, was it, for the mouldings? She said, why were they important, those dates?
Well, I actually read very recently it was kind of not kind of almost like a folk thing that brickmakers had and had sort of passed down to them. And I did look into it, and I think before the 1st of November, or at least roundabouts November for the extraction of the clay, I think that's probably to do with the frost coming and making the ground hard and making it much harder to extract the clay, and maybe even affecting the kind of moisture levels. The next one was the 1st of February for the kind of stirring process and kind of removing different particles from the clay. I think that's because I'm not entirely sure, but I think that had to happen over a number of weeks. It wasn't kind of like you could stir the clay in the pug mill and then it would be ready. I think it was quite a laborious process, particularly because there's so much chalk in this area as well. So to extract all of the impurities, and then 1st of March was the next one, and that was to kind of wrought the clay into the molds, and I think that was to let the clay kind of set and turn leather hard before it goes into the kiln, so giving it a kind of 4-week window to sit on the drying shelves and go a little bit harder to avoid cracking when it goes into the kiln. So I think that's why those 3 dates are quite important in the brickmaking calendar.
Thank you.
Have we any other questions?
No further ones have come in the chat.
They have.
No, I don't think so. There is there's a brickworks in Suffolk. Is it Suffolk? Is it the Bulmer Brickworks? Did I get that correct? I've never been and always wanted to go, but I know that it's got vast sort of archive of different brick molds and things like that. So I wonder if there might be any Cosseyware molds lurking in their archives. That'd be interesting.
That'd be great to see.
Yeah.
I'd be very keen to go on a tour of a traditional brickyard and kind of see all the stages in person and kind of how it's laid out. And yeah, I think that would be something I'd like to do, because I've done a lot of reading on it now, so to actually see it in situ.
There is a brickworks museum in Hampshire.
Is there?
Yeah. Can't remember the name of it.
Summer visits. One of the group's summer visits was to Bulmer's Brickyard back in 2006, 2005. It was absolutely fascinating. You'd see the speed with which they were just moulding these specialist bricks, because they make them to order, so they can match medieval brick sizes and materials. They weren't making architectural ceramics, but presumably they could if they were pushed to it.
Where's that again? Sorry, Ian. In
Bulmer.
Okay, great.
So Bulmer tie, is it? Is it that Essex name for green, the small greens, TYE, tie.
Okay, I'll have to note that.
And then Adrian Parker just says, in the south of England, the most famous terracotta works is at Bishop's Waltham.
Very close to Bulmer tie.
Oh. And then Sally also says, it would be interesting to know the distribution radius of Cosseyware.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have seen some Cosseyware in Lincolnshire, near the border with Norfolk, and as well in North Suffolk. But I haven't actually seen it in, not that I've done a very comprehensive tour of the whole country, but I haven't seen it in Essex or kind of Cambridgeshire. But it would be very good to have a kind of gazetteer of all the places where Cosseyware is known to be, just to get a better kind of map of its geographical reach.
I think that's all the questions for now.
Great.
Well, you've obviously stirred up a lot of interest from our members, Jess, and it's been a really excellent talk, and something we've all noticed, I'm sure, that we'll notice with greater interest and knowledge now in future. So thank you ever so much, and thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you.
And fortunately, everything's gone smoothly this time. I hope you're happy with the result yourself.
Yes, yeah, very happy.
So, Ian, did I hear you say something? Did you want to put something? No. Okay, well, thank you so much. And may we all unmute ourselves and give you a clap? Is that possible?
Yeah, it should be. That's enabled. Yep.
Right. So thank you ever so much. And we look forward to reading about it in the journal when that comes out as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Good night.
Right. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Right. I'm going to close the meeting now. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jess, in particular. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.